El juez me otorgó la tutela completa e irrevocable de mi madre, citando la evidencia de mala conducta financiera de mis tíos, su historial de fraude y la clara expresión de los deseos de mi madre cuando aún tenía capacidad para expresarlos. Ricardo y Mónica fueron prohibidos de tomar cualquier decisión relacionada con mi madre o sus bienes, y se ordenó a Ricardo devolver los $20,000 que había desviado de las cuentas de las tiendas, más intereses. Mónica fue obligada a devolver las joyas o pagar su valor estimado de $15,000. El juez fue particularmente duro en su lenguaje, describiendo sus acciones como un aprovechamiento despreciable de una mujer vulnerable en su momento de mayor necesidad. Debería haber sentido alivio, victoria incluso, pero solo sentí un cansancio profundo. La batalla había consumido 6 meses de mi vida, casi $30,000 en honorarios legales, y había destruido cualquier apariencia de unidad familiar que pudiera haber quedado. Ricardo y Mónica salieron de la sala del tribunal sin mirarme, sus rostros retorcidos en expresiones de rabia y humillación. Sabía que esto no terminaría aquí, que el resentimiento y la amargura que ahora sentían hacia mí duraría el resto de nuestras vidas. Pero había hecho lo correcto, había honrado la confianza que mi madre depositó en mí en sus últimos momentos de lucidez. Eso tendría que ser suficiente. Con la tutela asegurada, finalmente pude enfocarme en poner en orden los asuntos de mi madre sin obstáculos legales. Contraté a un contador forense para revisar completamente las finanzas de las tiendas y descubrir el alcance total del daño que Ricardo había causado. Resultó que el desfalco era aún mayor de lo que pensábamos. Casi $35,000 habían desaparecido a través de varios esquemas, no solo los $20,000 que habíamos probado en corte. Presenté cargos criminales adicionales, aunque mi abogado me advirtió que recuperar el dinero sería difícil, dado que Ricardo lo había gastado todo pagando sus propias deudas. Las tiendas de mi madre, que habían sido negocios prósperos durante 3 décadas, estaban ahora en situación financiera precaria, debido a la mala administración de Ricardo y a los fondos desviados. Tomé la difícil decisión de vender 2 de las 3 tiendas, consolidando operaciones en la ubicación más rentable y usando los fondos de las ventas para asegurar el cuidado a largo plazo de mi madre y estabilizar las finanzas. Fue doloroso desmantelar parte del legado que ella había construido con tanto esfuerzo, pero era necesario. Establecí un fideicomiso irrevocable con los activos restantes de mi madre, asegurando que su cuidado estaría financiado sin importar qué pasara, y nombrando a un banco como cofideicomisario para añadir una capa adicional de protección y supervisión. Hubo un día, aproximadamente un mes después de que terminara la batalla legal, cuando mi madre tuvo un momento inesperado de claridad. Yo estaba sentada junto a su cama, leyéndole un libro que solía gustarle, cuando de repente ella volteó hacia mí y dijo mi nombre claramente: «Patricia». Mi corazón se detuvo. Había pasado tanto tiempo desde la última vez que me reconoció que casi había olvidado cómo se sentía. «Mamá, estoy aquí», le dije, tomando su mano. Sus ojos, que habían estado vidriosos y distantes durante meses, tenían un destello de la mujer que ella había sido. «Lo hiciste, ¿verdad? Los detuviste». No estaba segura si realmente entendía lo que había pasado o si era solo una coincidencia, pero asentí. «Sí, mamá, hice lo que me pediste, cuidé de todo». Una lágrima rodó por su mejilla arrugada. «Sabía que podía confiar en ti, mi chija. Siempre lo supe. Perdóname por ponerte en esta situación, por dejarte esta carga». Lloré entonces, todas las emociones de los últimos meses saliendo en un torrente que no podía controlar. «No hay nada que perdonar, mamá. Hiciste lo que tenías que hacer para protegerme, para proteger todo lo que construiste. Estoy orgullosa de ser tu hija». Nos quedamos así, tomadas de las manos, por lo que pareció horas, pero probablemente fueron solo minutos. Y entonces la claridad se desvaneció de sus ojos otra vez, y ella volvió a perderse en las sombras de su mente. Pero tuve ese momento, ese último regalo de conexión real, y lo atesoraré por siempre. Ricardo y Mónica no aceptaron su derrota con gracia. Comenzaron una campaña de difamación contra mí dentro de la familia extendida, contándole a primos, tíos lejanos y amigos familiares que yo había manipulado a mi madre, que había robado su herencia legítima, que era una hija egoísta que había aislado a una mujer enferma de su familia amorosa. Algunos les creyeron, especialmente aquellos que no conocían toda la historia. De repente me encontré excluida de reuniones familiares, recibiendo llamadas de parientes que me acusaban de cosas terribles, siendo objeto de rumores viciosos que se esparcían por las redes sociales. Fue doloroso ver cómo personas que me habían conocido toda la vida dudaban de mí basándose en las mentiras de dos personas con un historial probado de fraude. Mi prima Ana, la hija de un hermano ya fallecido de mi madre, fue una de las pocas que me defendió públicamente. «Yo sé quiénes son Ricardo y Mónica», me dijo por teléfono una noche. «Mi padre me contó sobre el terreno robado antes de morir. Patricia, no dejes que te hagan sentir culpable por proteger a tu mamá». Su apoyo fue un bálsamo en medio del veneno que mis tíos estaban esparciendo. Ricardo también intentó apelar la decisión del juez, pero su apelación fue rechazada rápidamente por falta de méritos. El dinero que el juez le había ordenado devolver nunca llegó. Él declaró bancarrota personal, dejándome sin recursos legales prácticos para recuperarlo. El estrés de todo lo que había pasado comenzó a cobrar el precio en mi salud física y mental. Desarrollé insomnio severo, incapaz de apagar mi mente incluso cuando estaba exhausta. Perdí alrededor de 15 libras en 2 meses porque comer se sentía como una tarea imposible. Mi trabajo como maestra, que siempre había amado, se convirtió en algo que apenas podía manejar, llegando a casa cada tarde completamente agotada, sin energía para nada más. Comencé a ver a una terapista, una mujer paciente llamada Laura, que me ayudó a procesar no solo la traición de mis tíos, sino también el dolor anticipatorio de perder a mi madre lentamente, día tras día, a una enfermedad cruel que no dejaba nada atrás excepto una cáscara vacía. «Estás atravesando un duelo múltiple», me explicó Laura. «El duelo por la madre que ya no existe, el duelo por la familia que pensabas que tenías, el duelo por la inocencia perdida al descubrir de qué son capaces las personas por dinero. Todo eso es válido y real». Las sesiones me ayudaron a entender que no estaba loca por sentirme devastada, que lo que estaba experimentando era una respuesta normal a circunstancias extraordinariamente difíciles. Aprendí técnicas de respiración para los ataques de ansiedad que me asaltaban sin previo aviso, generalmente en mitad de la noche o cuando visitaba a mi madre y la encontraba sin reconocerme. Laura me ayudó a establecer límites saludables, a entender que no podía controlar lo que mis tíos decían sobre mí, que lo único que podía controlar era mi propia verdad y cómo elegía responder. Me recordó constantemente que había hecho lo correcto, que proteger a mi madre vulnerable no el egoísmo, sino amor en su forma más pura. Lentamente, muy lentamente, comencé a sanar, aunque sabía que las cicatrices de esta experiencia permanecerían conmigo para siempre. Cuando pensé que finalmente todo había terminado, que mis tíos habían agotado todas sus opciones, Ricardo hizo un último intento desesperado. Contactó con servicios de protección de adultos, presentando una denuncia anónima alegando que yo estaba abusando y negligente a mi madre, que la mantenían en condiciones insalubres, que le negaba atención médica adecuada. Era una acusación completamente falsa y maliciosa, pero aún así generó una investigación oficial. Una trabajadora social llamada Mariana apareció sin previo aviso en la casa de mi madre un martes por la tarde, presentándose y explicando que necesitaba inspeccionar las instalaciones y hablar con el personal de cuidado. Mi corazón se hundió porque sabía exactamente quién había hecho la denuncia y por qué, pero también sabía que no tenía nada que ocultar. Mariana pasó 3 horas en la casa de mi madre, revisando cada habitación, hablando extensamente con las cuidadoras, revisando los registros médicos de mi madre, observando cómo interactuaba yo con ella. Al final de su visita, su expresión era de indignación apenas contenida. «Esta denuncia es claramente falsa y maliciosa», me dijo directamente. «Su madre está recibiendo cuidado excepcional, probablemente mejor de lo que recibiría en cualquier instalación profesional. Quien haya presentado esta denuncia está abusando del sistema, y voy a incluir eso en mi reporte oficial». Le conté entonces toda la historia, la batalla por la tutela, el fraude histórico, la campaña de difamación. Mariana sacudió la cabeza con tristeza. «Veo esto muy seguido, familias destruidas por dinero. Lo siento mucho por lo que está pasando». Su reporte exoneró completamente mis cuidados y recomendó que no se tomara ninguna acción.
I decided to confront my uncles directly. I needed to see their faces when I asked about what I'd discovered. I invited them to dinner at a neutral restaurant, saying we needed to talk about my mother's future care. They arrived smiling, confident, with no idea what was coming. I waited until after we'd ordered, letting the conversation flow naturally, And then I laid out the documents Jorge had given me on the table. Can you explain to me why you've been consulting lawyers about guardianship and power of attorney? I asked calmly, looking straight at both of them. The smiles disappeared instantly. Ricardo recovered first, his voice turning defensive and condescending. Patricia, you're very young and you don't understand the complexities of handling the assets of someone with Alzheimer's. We're just being cautious, preparing for when your mother needs legal help. But Mónica was less careful. Her face flushed and her voice rose. You've been investigating us. How dare you? We're her family. We have as much right as you do to protect her interests. Then I pulled out the old documents I'd found in the basement, the papers about the land fraud 30 years ago. Protect her interests like you did when you stole her inheritance in 1992? The silence that followed was deafening. Ricardo was the first to speak after the initial shock, his voice now cold and calculating. That was 30 years ago, Patricia. Your mother got over it and moved on with her life. It has nothing to do with the present. But I wasn't going to let them off that easily. My mother never got over it. She has letters where she says she forgave you only to preserve family peace, but she never forgot. And now you're trying to do the same thing again, taking advantage of the fact that she's defenseless. Mónica tried a different approach, her eyes filling with fake tears. Look, we made a mistake when we were young, that's true. We needed the money desperately and made a terrible decision. But we've carried that guilt for decades. This time is different. We just want to make sure your mother is well taken care of. I asked them directly about the documents they'd prepared, about the property transfers, about their plans for my mother's stores. Ricardo finally admitted they had been exploring ways to consolidate my mother's assets under a more efficient administration, which in plain language meant taking control of everything. The stores are losing money, he argued. Your mother can no longer manage them and you have no business experience. Mónica and I could run them properly, keep them going, and make sure your mother has income for her care. I told them that would never happen as long as I was alive. The day after the confrontation, I hired the best family lawyer I could find, a woman named Daniela Ruiz, with 20 years of experience in guardianship and vulnerable adult protection cases. I showed her everything I'd found, the documents, the investigator's report, the old letters. She said, "You have a strong case after reviewing everything carefully. But you need to move fast because if your uncles file for guardianship first, they could win just by acting before you." That same afternoon, we began legal proceedings to appoint me as my mother's sole legal guardian based on the fact that I had been her primary caregiver throughout her illness, that I lived near her, and that I had her best interests at heart. We also filed for a temporary restraining order against Ricardo and Mónica, forbidding them from making any financial decisions related to my mother until the case was resolved. As expected, my uncles responded with their own guardianship petition 2 days later, arguing that I was too young and inexperienced, that they, as blood siblings, had more right, and that my mother would have wanted the whole family involved in her care. A legal war began that would last 6 months, consuming almost all my savings and attorney fees and court costs, while my mother faded further into the shadows of Alzheimer's, completely unaware of the battle being fought over her future. During the discovery process, where both sides must share relevant evidence, I uncovered even more lies my uncles had been weaving for months. Ricardo had been siphoning money from my mother's store accounts, small amounts at first, $500 here, $1,000 there, but in total nearly $20,000 in the last 6 months. When we confronted him legally, he claimed the money was for operational expenses and consultations with experts he had supposedly paid out of his own pocket. He had no receipts or documentation to back any of that up. Mónica, for her part, had convinced my mother on one of her more confused days to sign a document supposedly giving her permission to sell some family jewelry to pay medical expenses. The jewelry, which included my grandmother's diamond wedding ring worth at least $15,000, had disappeared. Monica insisted my mother had given them to her willingly as a show of sisterly love. We also discovered that they had been pressuring employees at my mother's stores to say I was neglectful in caring for her, offering them money and promising to keep their jobs if guardianship passed to them. One employee, a loyal woman named Carmen, who had worked for my mother for 15 years, came to me in tears to tell me everything. As the legal battle intensified, my mother's condition worsened quickly. She went from forgetting names and dates to not recognizing familiar places, and finally to not recognizing me most of the time. Some days she looked at me in confusion when I walked into her room, asking who I was and what I was doing in her house. Other days she confused me with her own mother, calling me Mom and asking about people who had been dead for decades. The doctors warned me she was entering the final stages of the disease, that she likely had months, not years, left. Each visit became more painful, watching the strong woman who had raised me reduced to a frightened, confused shadow of herself. But what hurt the most was knowing that somewhere, deep inside her fragmented mind, she had tried to warn me. She had used her last lucid moments to protect me from the betrayal she saw coming, and I had almost ignored her, almost written off her words as just another delirium. I hired full-time caregivers to stay with her, trained, compassionate women who could give her the constant attention she needed. I changed all the locks in her house and set strict rules. Ricardo and Mónica could only visit her with me present or with a neutral witness. They were never allowed to be alone with her, and any attempt to violate those rules would result in immediate legal action. The guardianship hearing took place in a cold, sterile family courtroom, presided over by a stern-looking judge who probably had seen hundreds of similar cases of families fighting for control and money. Daniela presented our case meticulously: my dedication to my mother's care, the documents proving my uncle's past fraud, the evidence of diverted funds, the missing jewelry, the employees' testimonies about attempted bribery. Ricardo and Mónica presented their case with an expensive lawyer who tried to paint me as a controlling daughter, isolating my mother from her family, inexperienced at handling complex financial matters, acting out of selfish motives. They brought in witnesses, mostly their friends, who testified that my uncles were honorable people who only wanted the best for their sister. It was brutal, listening to people who hardly knew my mother talk about what she would have wanted, while I, who had spent every day of the last 2 years caring for her, had to defend my right to protect her. The turning point came when Daniela submitted audio recordings I had made of conversations with my mother, including the one where she warned me about my uncles. The judge listened to my mother's trembling but clear voice saying, "Don't trust them," and I saw his expression change. After 2 hours of deliberation, the judge issued his ruling.
The judge granted me full and irrevocable guardianship of my mother, citing the evidence of my uncle's financial misconduct, their history of fraud, and my mother's clearly expressed wishes when she still had the capacity to express them. Ricardo and Mónica were barred from making any decisions regarding my mother or her assets, and Ricardo was ordered to repay the $20,000 he had diverted from the store accounts, plus interest. Mónica was ordered to return the jewelry or pay its estimated value of $15,000. The judge was particularly harsh in his wording, describing their actions as a despicable exploitation of a vulnerable woman at her moment of greatest need. I should have felt relief, even victory, but all I felt was deep exhaustion. The battle had consumed 6 months of my life, almost $30,000 in legal fees, and had destroyed any remaining appearance of family unity. Ricardo and Mónica left the courtroom without looking at me, their faces twisted with rage and humiliation. I knew this wouldn't end there, that the resentment and bitterness they now felt toward me would last the rest of our lives. But I had done the right thing. I had honored the trust my mother placed in me in her last lucid moments. That would have to be enough. With guardianship secured,
I could finally focus on putting my mother's affairs in order without legal obstacles. I hired a forensic accountant to thoroughly review the store's finances and determine the full extent of the damage Ricardo had caused. It turned out the embezzlement was even greater than we thought. Nearly $35,000 had disappeared through several schemes, not just the $20,000 we had proven in court. I filed additional criminal charges, though my lawyer warned me that recovering the money would be difficult since Ricardo had spent it all paying his own debts. My mother's stores, once prosperous businesses for 3 decades, were now in precarious financial condition because of Ricardo's mismanagement and the diverted funds. I made the hard decision to sell 2 of the 3 stores, consolidating operations at the most profitable location and using the sale proceeds to secure my mother's long-term care and stabilize her finances. It hurt to dismantle part of the legacy she had worked so hard to build, but it was necessary. I set up an irrevocable trust with my mother's remaining assets, ensuring her care would be funded no matter what happened, and named a bank as co-trustee to add another layer of protection and oversight. About a month after the legal battle ended, my mother had an unexpected moment of clarity. I was sitting by her bed reading her a book she used to love when she suddenly turned toward me and said my name clearly. "Patricia!" My heart stopped. It had been so long since she'd recognized me that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. "Mom, I'm here," I said, taking her hand. Her eyes, which had been glazed and distant for months, now had a spark of the woman she used to be. "You did it, didn't you? You stopped them." I wasn't sure if she truly understood what had happened or if it was just coincidence, but I nodded. "Yes, Mom, I did what you asked. I took care of everything." A tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek. "I knew I could trust you, sweetheart. I always knew. Forgive me for putting you in this situation, for leaving you with this burden." I broke down then, all the emotions of the past months pouring out in a torrent I couldn't control. "There's nothing to forgive, Mom. You did what you had to do to protect me, to protect everything you built. I'm proud to be your daughter." We stayed like that, holding hands, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then the clarity faded from her eyes again, and she slipped back into the shadows of her mind. But I had that moment, that final gift of real connection, and I will treasure it forever. Ricardo and Mónica did not accept their defeat gracefully. They started a smear campaign against me within the extended family, telling cousins, distant uncles, and family friends that I had manipulated my mother, that I had stolen their rightful inheritance, that I was a selfish daughter who had isolated a sick woman from her loving family. Some believed them, especially those who didn't know the whole story. Suddenly, I found myself excluded from family gatherings, receiving calls from relatives accusing me of terrible things, becoming the target of vicious rumors spread on social media. It was painful to see people who had known me my whole life doubt me based on the lies of 2 people with a proven history of fraud. But it also revealed who was truly loyal, who took the time to ask for my side before judging me. My cousin, Anna, the daughter of one of my mother's now deceased brothers, was one of the few who defended me publicly. She told me over the phone one night, "I know who Ricardo and Mónica are. My dad told me about the stolen land before he died. Patricia, don't let them make you feel guilty for protecting your mom." Her support was a balm in the middle of the poison my uncles were spreading. Ricardo also tried to appeal the judge's decision, but his appeal was quickly rejected for lack of merit. The money the judge had ordered him to repay never came. He declared personal bankruptcy, leaving me with no practical legal way to recover it. The stress of everything that had happened began to take a toll on my physical and mental health. I developed severe insomnia, unable to shut off my mind even when I was exhausted. I lost almost 15 pounds in 2 months because eating felt like an impossible task. My job, as a teacher, which I had always loved, became something I could barely handle, coming home every afternoon completely drained with no energy for anything else. I started seeing a therapist, a patient woman named Laura, who helped me process not only my uncle's betrayal, but also the anticipatory grief of slowly losing my mother day by day to a cruel disease that left behind nothing but an empty shell. You are going through multiple grief. Grief for the mother who no longer exists, grief for the family you thought you had, grief for the lost innocence of discovering what people are capable of for money. All of that is valid and real. The sessions helped me understand I wasn't crazy for feeling devastated, that what I was experiencing was a normal response to extraordinary, difficult circumstances. I learned breathing techniques for the panic attacks that hit without warning, usually in the middle of the night or when I visited my mother and she didn't recognize me. Laura helped me set healthy boundaries, to understand I couldn't control what my uncle said about me, that the only thing I could control was my own truth and how I chose to respond. She reminded me constantly that I had done the right thing, that protecting my vulnerable mother was not selfishness, but love in its purest form. Slowly, very slowly, I began to heal, though I knew the scars from this experience would stay with me forever. Just when I thought everything was finally over, that my uncles had exhausted all of their options, Ricardo made one last desperate attempt. He contacted Adult Protective Services, filing an anonymous complaint claiming I was abusing and neglecting my mother, that I was keeping her in unsanitary conditions and denying her proper medical care. It was completely false, malicious accusation, but it still triggered an official investigation. A social worker named Mariana showed up unannounced at my mother's house on a Tuesday afternoon, introducing herself and explaining that she needed to inspect the premises and speak with the staff. My heart sunk, because I knew exactly who had filed the complaint and why. But I also knew I had nothing to hide. Mariana spent 3 hours at the house, checking every room, talking extensively with the caregivers, reviewing my mother's medical records, observing how I interacted with her. By the end of her visit, her expression was one of barely contained indignation. "This report is clearly false and malicious," she told me bluntly. "Your mother is receiving exceptional care, probably better than she would get in most professional facilities. Whoever filed this complaint is abusing the system, and I'm going to include that in my official report." Then I told her the whole story, the guardianship battle, the old fraud, the smear campaign. Mariana shook her head sadly. "I see this far too often. Families destroyed by money. I'm very sorry for what you're going through." Her report fully cleared my care of any wrongdoing and recommended no action be taken.
One night, while rereading the old letters I had found in my mother's basement, I realized something I hadn't fully processed before. In a letter she had written to her lawyer in 1993, explaining why she was dropping the lawsuit against her siblings, she wrote, "I've decided to forgive them not because what they did is right, but because carrying hatred is destroying me inside. I need to let it go so I can move on with my life. That doesn't mean I will ever trust them again, but I'm also not going to let their betrayal define who I am." Those words resonated deeply. I had been carrying so much anger toward Ricardo and Mónica, anger that was certainly justified, but that was consuming my energy and stealing my peace. I realized I needed to find my own way to forgive, not for them, but for myself. It didn't mean forgetting what they had done or letting them near my mother or her assets ever again. It meant letting go of the bitterness that was poisoning me. I wrote letters I never sent, letters where I told them everything I felt, where I acknowledged the pain they had caused, but also declared that I would not give them the power to ruin my life. I burned the letters in the fireplace, watching the smoke symbolically carry away the weight I had been carrying. It wasn't a one-time process. Forgiveness never is. There were days when the anger came back full force, but slowly I began to find peace, rebuilding my life around caring for my mother and my own well-being instead of around the war with my uncles. My mother entered her final weeks of life in the fall of 2024. Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where she could no longer walk, could barely swallow, and spent most of her time sleeping. The doctors explained her body was simply shutting down, that it was a matter of days or weeks before the disease finally won. I took a leave of absence from work and moved temporarily into her house to be with her constantly. I hired a hospice nurse, a compassionate woman named Rosa, who had cared for hundreds of patients in their final days and helped me understand what to expect and how to make my mother as comfortable as possible. I spent those days sitting by her bed, talking to her even though I wasn't sure she could hear me, reading her favorite books, playing her favorite music. I told her about my life, about the good memories from my childhood, about how her lessons had shaped the person I am. I thanked her for raising me, for giving me unconditional love, for being strong enough to warn me of danger even as her mind was slipping away. "I kept my promise, Mom," I whispered one night, holding her fragile hand. "I protected everything you built. I protected your legacy, and no one took anything from you without a fight." I don't know if she understood, but her breathing seemed to calm a little when I spoke. My mother died on a quiet November morning, with sunlight gently filtering through her window and me holding her hand. There was no drama, no final crisis. Her breathing just grew shallower and shallower until it eventually stopped. Rosa checked her pulse, looked at me with eyes full of compassion, and nodded. "She went peacefully," she said softly. I sat with her for another hour, not letting go of her hand, crying all the tears I had been holding in for years. I cried for the strong woman she had been, for the battles she fought alone, for the secrets she had carried, for the cruel disease that stole her mind before her body. I cried for myself, for the little girl who had lost her parents and been raised by this extraordinary woman, for the adult who had had to learn harsh lessons about family betrayal and greed. But I also felt a strange sense of relief, knowing her suffering was over, that she was no longer trapped in a mind that didn't work, that she was finally at peace. The funeral was small, attended only by the people who truly loved her. Some of her loyal employees, my cousin Anna, a few close neighbors, and the caregivers who had looked after her in her final months. Ricardo and Mónica were not invited, and although they tried to show up anyway, the security I had hired denied them entry. Maybe it was petty of me, but I felt my mother wouldn't have wanted them there. Not after everything they had tried to do to her. A week after the funeral, we met in Daniela's office for the official reading of my mother's will. She had updated it 3 months before Alzheimer's progressed too far, in one of her last legally valid actions. I was the sole beneficiary of everything. The house, the remaining store, the bank accounts, the investments, everything that was left of the empire she had built with such hard work. But there was a special clause that surprised me.
My mother had left specific instructions that $1,000 be sent to Ricardo and $1,000 to Mónica, each accompanied by a letter she had written. The letters were identical, and Daniela read one of them aloud. Ricardo/Mónica, I leave you this symbolic amount not as a sign of love, but as a reminder of what you chose to value over family. You chose money over loyalty, greed over love, betrayal over honesty. This money is all you will get from me, and I hope that every time you see it, it reminds you of the price you paid for your greed. I do not hate you, because hatred requires energy I prefer to devote to those who truly loved me. But I do not forgive you either, because some actions are beyond forgiveness. Live with your decisions, as I have lived with mine. It was harsh, final, and perfectly her. Even in her last conscious legal acts, my mother had found a way to make her position clear, to have the last word in a battle that had begun decades earlier. With my mother's inheritance, I made careful decisions about how to honor her memory. I sold the house. It was too big and too full of painful memories, and used part of the money to establish a foundation in her name to support Alzheimer's research and provide resources for families affected by the disease. I turned the other store into a business run by the loyal employees who had been with my mother for years, setting up a cooperative where they were the owners and decision makers. It was what my mother would have wanted, to empower the women who had been loyal when others betrayed her. I invested the remaining money carefully, securing my own future, but also creating opportunities to help others. I set up a scholarship fund for low-income students who wanted to study business, continuing my mother's legacy of creating opportunities where none existed before. Over time, these decisions gave me a sense of purpose I had lost during the legal battle. I wasn't just protecting my mother's past. I was building something new, based on her values. Every time a family received support from the foundation, every time a cooperative employee told me about their success, every time a student received a scholarship, I felt my mother living through these actions. Her legacy was not just the money she left behind, but the values she instilled and the lives she touched, including mine. 2 years have passed since my mother's death, and now I can look back with a perspective I didn't have in the middle of the pain and chaos. I learned that blood relatives are not always the family that protects you, that some people are willing to destroy any bond for money, and that greed can turn even siblings into enemies. But I also learned about my own strength, about the importance of trusting your instincts even when others say you're wrong, and about the value of fighting for those you love when they can no longer fight for themselves. My mother gave me many gifts in life: love, education, solid values. But her last gift was the warning she gave me in her final moments of clarity, the words that prepared me to protect her when she was at her most vulnerable. It was a profound act of love to use her last